highlights from the notes that you were given in worship, maybe make a few kind of like bigger top contour points about liturgy from my particular perspective, but also a chance for you all to be able to get your own questions answered. I know many folks feel like they carry around dumb questions about our ritual, our ceremony, and there really are no dumb questions. I continue to learn about why we do some of the things that we do. So I may not have an answer to your question, but everything really is fair game. And I've had kind of a busy week, so there has not been as much time to prepare as I would have liked. So where do we want to start? Why don't we go through some of these notes for the service itself, and maybe we can pause. This might be, if you have particular questions about why we do what we do, or maybe what's missing, maybe you all have come from other liturgical traditions or even just other traditions and you notice things that have been really precious and important to your own piety that are not around in our liturgy. We can definitely pause and we can talk about that as well. I think things are pretty self-explanatory with Rite 1 and Rite 2. I think I often get a question. So we are in that very first little note, it says Rite 1 preserves the Elizabethan language. Rite 2 does not, uses modern language. In this church, the 8 a.m. service used to always be in Rite 1. Now the 8 a.m. service is in Rite 1 for the season of Advent and Lent. So if you want to come and dip in and sort of hear the language that really was Episcopal worship all the way through the 1928 prayer book, so that was up until about 1978, before the 1979 prayer book, please come and experience that at the 8 a.m. service. I think you all know about liturgical seasons. We're in the midst of the longest liturgical season. It's really about 6 months of the year. We're about to change, and much will change with that in the first Sunday of Advent. Kneeling and praying, I think that this is an important part of many people's piety when they come into the church. Sometimes people are just kneeling and praying for a minute or 2 minutes. Sometimes people get to church 15 minutes early. And that's a really important part of their worship, the silence, maybe the greeting of a few people around them quietly. We've gotten now into the habit of making an announcement before the prelude to give folks who really do value that quiet time a little break from the visiting around them. So we're grateful that you continue that experiment with keeping some quiet during the prelude. This little note about ancient processions were for Caesar's military victories. I mean, this was really brought home to me just from that 2 weeks ago being in Rome. And these military parades were really such an enormous part of proclaiming Caesar as God's son, the appointed one, or proclaiming the glory of any particular military general. They'd have these massive processions, parades. And so the early church, there are many, many things that the early church just simply adopts from Roman society. I continue to learn about these. For example, a basilica. A basilica was originally simply a large gathering space for Rome, for them to be able to do the business of the empire. So when the church looks to when Christianity is finally legalized, and so people can actually build structures or they can actually have public worship within structures, the church just simply takes the model that has worked pretty well for large structures in Roman society and begins to worship in that particular way. So the basilica, its architecture just carries right into to early Christian worship once it's legal, 312, 315, and beyond. And I think that general principle can be seen throughout church history, the church kind of baptizing secular practice, not really feeling the need to kind of like completely reinvent, but to take something that was profane, something of the world, and to bring it into the purview of God's kingdom. If you have any questions, just interrupt me. If you have a point that you want to make, because there's a lot of wisdom in this room around liturgy too. So please feel free. At the words, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, some make the sign of the cross. These manual acts are never required, and they've always been, the Episcopal Church and the Anglican tradition has always been a mismatch, or not mismatch, a patchwork of different people practicing in different ways. That goes back from the very beginning of the church, when there was really intense conflict in England after Henry VIII declares himself as the supreme ruler of the Church of England. And many people want to take the church back under Rome. In subsequent years, the Puritans, those who have really bought into the Protestant Reformation, they want to take the church even further into the Reformation and throw out all kinds of practices. And so ever since Queen Elizabeth, what's called the Elizabethan settlement, where she makes worship mandatory, she says we're going to use this Book of Common Prayer, and there are going to be very different expressions of piety. Some of you are going to cross yourselves, some of you are not. Some of you are going to have different beliefs about what's happening within worship. For example, when the priest holds up the host, some of you are going to see that as Christ's very body, very flesh, based on transubstantiation. Some of you are going to have a much more symbolic view of the Eucharist. But we're going to pray together, we're going to worship together, we're going to make a community together. And this is the legacy in which we live, and the legacy of practice that we actually see week to week. I think sometimes, this is sort of like in my last Deeper Roots class, I was asked, like high church, low church. Do people feel like they have a pretty good handle on like high church, low church? Yes, no. I mean, I explained it then. If I had to kind of give like a nutshell definition of high church versus low church, I would say that low church on the whole says that some of these extra acts, crossing oneself, like genuflecting, chanting instead of saying prayers, vestments, like these kind of like a low church community would say that many of these things are distractions, that they actually take away from one's encounter with God. And then on the opposite end, high church, those folks are intuitively drawn to those kinds of additions, crossing oneself, praying with the body. The more ornate the vestments, the more one has a sense of the glory and texture of the gospel, so on and so forth. And so I love that Anglicanism, there are many different expressions of beautiful worship. So if you go down to an Episcopal church like in Alexandria, Virginia, you can find churches that the priest would never think to wear this ornate poncho, a silken poncho called a chasuble. The priest would never chant the Eucharist. They would never have incense even on the holiest even on the great feast days. Some of that is just the particular DNA of the church and the way that it was founded and the ways that people have kind of upheld those really local traditions over time. But some of it, I think, is an intentional choice to make things more simple, with a fear that some of these things can distract. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I went to the church where I did my field education in Washington, D.C. It's called St. Paul's K Street. They have a high solemn mass every Sunday, and so there were all kinds of smells and bells and to the point where the altar, so most churches, so beginning with what's called the liturgical movement in the 1930s and 1940s, the liturgical scholars went back and they tried to see, what was early worship like, and it was through that archaeology and anthropology and historical study, they got a little bit better sense of the ways that, first of all, the Eucharist was very much central to early Christian worship. Even when Christian worship was illegal and was just happening in homes, it seemed like people were breaking bread every time they gathered for Sunday worship. And so things like that. So like the Episcopal Church, some of you grew up in the Episcopal Church where maybe there was only communion once a month, if once a month. Did anybody have that particular experience? So for like many churches in Virginia, they even up until the 1979 prayer book just had communion once a month. They had morning prayer for three of the four other Sundays. To go back to the altar, so one of the things they also discovered was that because the Eucharist was so centered around a table with the celebrant being host to those gathered, they went into these churches where the altar was bolted against the wall, and this was the case at Christ Church. This great big heavy concrete altar used to be right up against the wall. And then the priest would face liturgical east, even though this is west. East is, liturgically, is the symbol of sunrise, resurrection after the darkness. So many churches are built to orient east, but you have to work with your local context. And so, just like what happened here, they took these big altars and they moved them out from the wall so that priest and deacon could slip behind, and the Eucharist could be a little bit more, could have this kind of different feel. Now, for every liturgical decision, I think this is like true for all of life. Like there are no sort of pure goods. There's always trade-off, right? Always trade-off in everything. And so what do you think of if you're thinking of like what is the trade-off? What are the trade-off of moving the altar out and then the priest slipping in behind and seeing the people face to face? Like if you had to think of like the shadow side or the downside of that, what would you say? Yeah.
Not for me, not for us. And in other words, it's held by the clergy, by the Roman Catholic clergy. I can watch and participate as an onlooker, but I'm certainly not welcome as a participant. It's held, it's owned. I think non-verbally, the non-verbal communication to me was it's owned by them.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's really interesting. So it feels a little bit like this sort of holy performance that you're invited to look upon. And so that's a real pro of having this more kind of personal human exchange when the priest then faces the people. Yeah, good. What other pros and cons for that liturgical? Yeah, Joy.
So I was in the church in the 90s where we moved it from the back.
Yeah.
They liked it because the priest to us, we're all together facing God, and we turn it, and now we're facing the priest.
Yeah.
The priest performed to us, we're talking priest, and we're not all together in the same direction.
Yeah, right. So I think there's a few things I hear in that. There's a sense of unity when you're all facing in one direction. You're all the people of God, and so maybe that actually sort of like maybe counters or at least complements the idea that it's only the priest, because it's actually like we're all doing the same thing together. I think also that sense of God as transcendent, God as this mystery that is beyond us, and you get that sense, like you get maybe you have to use a little bit more of your imagination when it's the priest looking you in the eye or you looking at the priest, to remember that the priest is gathering all of the people, saying these prayers on behalf of the people to God, whereas that's a little bit more apparent when you're all facing this way. As an aside, that is the reason that a few times in the service I do turn my back, where the celebrant turns his or her back and does face that way. So that's interesting, like they did that in the 90s. There are still a few Episcopal churches, including the one that I went to in seminary, where the altar is still up against the wall. It's still east-facing, and so it's still this real emphasis on mystery and on transcendence. Unapproachable light, maybe, yeah. Like the awe, utter awe and reverence. And I do think, there's all this interesting stuff that's coming out about awe, right? There's like new psychological studies. People are doing their dissertations. People are writing books about how all of us need to incorporate awe more into our lives, how good that is for all kinds of things. I think they're even like hooking up people into these brain scanners, and they're like showing them, they put on VR. I read about an article. They put on VR goggles and they show them like the heavens, or not the heaven, the night sky, and they kind of like trace the parts of the brain that do seem to light up from awe and reverence. And I don't think that you need to be east-facing to get that. But I guess this is one of those larger points about worship, is that I think one of the things that we're trying to engender is a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of being a part of something that's just much larger than yourself. And so, you definitely can get that. When I go out and I look at the lake, there's that kind of infinite horizon. When you see a newborn, I got to hold one of these twins that was recently born to Anna Flock-Arcello at like 8 days. That is awe and reverence, if there ever is some, right? So there are definitely these elements in our daily lives that can produce awe and reverence, but we try to craft liturgy with some of these ancient rituals to put ourselves in the place of maybe experiencing some of that awe week to week. Now, sometimes you feel it and sometimes you don't, and we don't try to manipulate your emotions really too much in the Episcopal Church. I grew up in a more evangelical tradition in which there really was this kind of this constant sense that we have to like entertain you, keep your attention, make you feel certain things at certain points in the service. It felt a little manipulative to me, and I like that you can come into Episcopal worship and you can be your lowest low or your highest high, and there's going to be a place for you in that liturgy. You're not going to have to sort of like feel this kind of corporate or group pressure to get your emotions to where like the pastor wants your emotions to be, or where everybody else is on that particular day or in that particular part of the liturgy. Does that resonate with people? Do people have any other comments about like awe, reverence, emotion? Yeah.
So, kind of taking your comments about people being upset. We witnessed a whole thing where often it would be guest priest from the archdiocese, not the pastor, I would say. They would come in, facing the congregation, trying to make the Mass so user-friendly. They would be constantly adding to liturgical words.
Mm-hmm.
Here we're gathering, kind of like this, but adding it during the service.
Mm.
And it just got, forgive me, a little talk show.
Yeah, sure.
We want to make sure we're all on the same page here, so I'm just going to add a little expertise to this. So, and I just kind of went, it's the liturgy, the words will do it, just do it.
Yeah, well,
So that was a phase
Well, and I think that's right. That's the tension that you walk as someone who is really in charge of the liturgy, the celebrant for that particular day. I always think of, one of the reasons that you wear vestments, whether you wear a chasuble or you just wear an alb, the reason is to try to make the particular personality of the person kind of diminish that as much as possible. So, you can see my face, and you can see like my height, I guess, and my hands, but like there's not a lot that would distinguish me from any other celebrant on any other day except some of those markers. And so the point of vestments is to, at least partly, to remove the particular personality, thoughts, ideas of that particular person, so that those things don't dominate the whole experience of liturgy. They do come out in the sermon. Here they also come out in the announcements. We're like most Episcopal churches where we do announcements in the middle. Some do it at the beginning or the end. So you do have these times, but I try to be really careful about not having too much of Seth and Seth's thoughts and ideas kind of bleed into and over the rest of the liturgy. Because, I've got my certain opinions, but and certain ways of doing things and certain little comments, and that on any given day that might resonate with some. It might really turn off others, but either way, it's just a very limited take on these. Why not just kind of like go with these ancient, time-tested words that have held people up for a really long time? Yeah. Yeah.
As someone who grew up in a different Protestant tradition, I don't have the 30-year timeline of how things have been evolving within the Episcopal tradition in this sense, but has there been a trend, and is there tension today about the extent that those ancient words are gendered?
Gendered. Yeah, it's a really good question. There is a tension in the church around gendered language. This comes up on every one of my Deeper Roots classes, and it comes up more and more. Like getting rid of, or at least complementing with a different gender so that it's not always he for God. I think it's a really legitimate criticism. I think so there's a commission now that's working on a new Book of Common Prayer. This is like the new prayer book, but this is like over 50 years old now, the 1979 book. I don't know that there's going to actually be another bound 2027 prayer book. I think there are liturgies that are put out by the Episcopal Church and then approved at the Triennial Convention. The liturgies that are emerging, for example, in the summertime, we use this Enriching Our Worship, which is a Episcopal approved prayer over the bread and the wine, the Eucharistic prayer. That is very self-consciously not using masculine language for God. And so it's not necessarily going out of its way to gender God as with she pronouns, but it's much more conscious of the ways that God transcends gender, which in many ways just seems like that's a no-brainer. I do think that the Episcopal Church just generally, compared to other Protestant denominations, for better and for worse, and again, this is like the shadow side, right? Of like everything you do, there's a shadow side. I think the Episcopal Church, compared to Protestant denominations, because I like to think of the Episcopal Church as Reformed but not Protestant, and people will argue with that. I like to think of it as this middle way, different from these Protestant denominations. Protestant denominations have been quicker to adopt less gendered language, to really strike it, and to be more playful and experimental with even bringing in more female language for God. I think the Episcopal Church, kind of like in this tension of really wanting to honor some of these older forms, is less. It kind of like we just sort of intuitively sort of bristle at like bringing in too much new. And again, for better or worse. But it'll be interesting. That's a beautiful mural, but I think you see there's one part of the Sistine Chapel where God is coming at you, and then God is like going away, and you see kind of like God from behind. I mean, God is a man with like a man's, backside. It's very strange. But this was the worldview for a really long time. So right, trying to evolve with care. Yeah, good question.
It's not lost on us the sociological implications of God continuing to be viewed as male. I mean, it's not lost on any one of us, right?
Sure.
And the rights of a female person.
And I think...
And their respect and their dignity as opposed to... It's not lost on us. And boy, I'll tell you, I mean, I'll speak for my wife and myself, but when we were in Door County in Sister Bay and saw Mother Britt at the Episcopal Church in Sister Bay preside, it released a lot of joy in us to see a female priest. What a loosening of years of constriction and sorrow from the Roman Catholic tradition. Really deep sorrow of the rights of women in the Roman Catholic Church. So I'm sorry to go on and on, but I mean, this is so fundamental.
Well, and I think that to your point, I mean, I think one of the ways that one of the ways the Episcopal Church makes peace with not like completely expunging male pronouns from every liturgical rite is that we have ordained women. Women can be bishops, presiding bishop. So it does seem like where it really matters, which is like on the ground in women's lives, the Episcopal Church has opened up a lot more space. But I don't want to speak. I know that some of my female colleagues really do take issue with some of the male language, so I don't want to try to like soften it and excuse the church. It is a tension, but I think we're moving in the right way. Let's see. If I'm just going to point out a few more notes from here, collect, biblical lessons. We really are bound. 99% of the time we're bound by what the lectionary gives us to preach on for any given Sunday. We don't mess around with it too much, a little bit here and there. Stewardship Sunday, I substituted something for the theme of that week. The lectionary, of course, is another way that you all as the parish are spared from the particular tastes of the priest, because if it was up to me, probably unconsciously, I would always be preaching on about, 10 different things, or 10, I certainly wouldn't dive into trying to find good news in some of those brutal parables in Matthew. But those brutal parables in Matthew, for better or worse, have shaped the church for 2,000 years. And for 2,000 years, people have had to wrestle with where is God in this? Where is there good news in this? And I think that very exercise of having to take some of the biblical lessons that are at first glance very difficult, that very exercise builds in us the lenses to try to approach much of life where like, oh, this is not my first choice, or this person seems like they could teach me nothing, or this is really anathema to me. Like, to be able to sit with it and to think about it with some different lenses to that particular person or idea, maybe that actually is what I need to hear. Maybe there's some truth in that person. Maybe there's some goodness in that person. Maybe there's something that can, augment my own understanding. So I do think that's kind of like it's sort of a corollary, like a psychological corollary to having to encounter text that we would rather not read. And occasionally I'll sub them out. Like for example, with I did do it on purpose, I'll be honest. But like Stewardship Sunday, I was going to use this lesson anyway, but the lesson was all about it was the divorce lesson from Mark, in which Jesus really doubles down on if a woman has remarried, she's committing adultery. So I don't relish ever preaching on that one. I always find that really hard to find good news in that, and so I subbed it out for stewardship. But I think that general principle still holds. So we do, the little, these little crosses when the deacon. Has anybody adopted particular manual acts and it's new to them and they've appreciated it, like they didn't grow up with it and it's been part of their piety? Pam? Yeah. Oh, it's my phone. Thank you. We're in the gospel, when Nancy reads the gospel and you do the little crosses on your forehead and on your lips and on your heart. Oh yeah, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Yeah. Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. That's the one. That's the one. I mean, some of these rituals that people do they don't quite know why. It's like been a part of their life for a long, long time, and it's very precious to their own sense of worship. Let's see. So the confession, the peace. Yeah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Yep. Let me just go through some of these other pieces, the confession, the peace, the offertory. I'm on page 7. I'm going very quickly. The Great Thanksgiving. We haven't done prayer C on page 7. So not everybody has a bulletin. I should have told you to grab one, but not really necessary. But for some, it has been a really long time since we've done this kind of back and forth in the Eucharistic prayer. I actually really like it because I like that kind of participation from the people. So it's not just all me up there. But we will, in the first Sunday of Advent, we'll go back. Our liturgy switches, and we'll start using prayer B again. I've got some notes in here about sort of like the particular ways that the Eucharist flows, the words of institution. There's the Sanctus. We've got this concluding doxology, the Lord's Prayer, the fraction when the priest breaks the bread, the invitation, communion, post-communion prayer. We're using the prayer of St. Francis now, and then the dismissal. Let me talk, are there any other comments or questions about like the particularities of the service, either the notes that are given or other things people want to raise? Because let me make a few more points about sort of liturgy on the whole. All right, so people mentioned, I think Matt mentioned that worship connects us across space and across time. If you were coming out of a Protestant tradition in which the local pastor is creating worship for that particular day, there can be a lot of creativity in that, and there really can be authentic worship in that. But one of the things you miss is that when you're here in an Episcopal church, you know that there are thousands of worshipers, both in the U.S. and then there's also Episcopal churches. Like I actually went to an Episcopal church in Rome that's a part of a diocese of it's called like the Convocation of Europe. That you're participating in a church where these words are very, very similar across space. And then our words are really, the words of the Book of Common Prayer are not that different from the Methodist Church and the Lutheran Church. And so we're in full communion with the ELCA, the more progressive part of the Lutheran Church. Full communion means that Christ Church could actually hire a Lutheran pastor, and that I could actually go and work at a Lutheran church. They could hire me. So it's been determined that our theology and our liturgies, our worship, is similar enough that we could be in full communion. We're actually in talks with the Methodist Church for having full communion with the Methodist Church, so that I have no plans to work at the Whitefish Bay Methodist Church. I know, join Ann over there, but that if that happens, now everybody kind of plays in their own sandbox. Like there's not a lot of like Lutheran churches hiring Episcopal priests. It does happen, and there probably won't be with the Methodists anytime soon. But you are using. My brother actually just got married in a little Methodist church, and some of the words were, and the structure of the wedding service was almost identical. I think our language is a little more high. It's a little more formal. I think it's a little more beautiful. The Methodists have, dumbed down sounds really bad. It sounds real bad, but it's definitely, Ann is nodding her head. She's over at the Methodist Church. They've made it more accessible. That would be the more generous way, is they've made it more accessible. But I think people can rise to some of that really beautiful language. So I appreciate that. But it is connecting us across space, and then of course it's connecting us down through time. The beauty of the synthesis in the original prayer book, 1542 by Thomas Cranmer. I mean, Thomas Cranmer was taking these medieval rites. Some of those medieval rites trace themselves back into the 4th and 5th century. So Thomas Cranmer, in creating the Book of Common Prayer and in really setting the groundwork for Anglicanism, it goes out of his way to say we're not going to really ditch the past and start over. And that's really a major theme of much of other Protestant traditions. Calvin is like, there's been so much accretion, there's been so many barnacles that have like kind of latched on to the mother church, to the ship, that we just need to like scrape it all clean and like begin again. And Anglicanism really is hesitant to do that. It definitely changes theology. Priests begin to marry. The liturgy is in the language of the people. There's no things like indulgences go out. But like the general pattern of worship, using the Book of Common Prayer, continues to connect people back down through the ages. I might preach about this on All Saints Sunday, which is next week, but I listened to this really interesting podcast about thinking not just about our connection to the past, but the way that we really need to be thinking like generations into the future. And we get this from the sustainability movement, the environmental movement, but this person was trying to help us think about like what we do today really does have these ripple effects. And it's very, very hard unless you're intentional about kind of like conceiving of the world that way. It's really hard to kind of get your head around that. But this person's point was one of the first steps is that you really think about your connection to the past and all the generations that have come before you, and that we all stand on the shoulders of people's lives that have given us value and meaning, and people who've taught us to bring us where we are today. And so I do like to think of the fact that we worship in an ancient tradition, that we're connected to the past. I hope, especially if we can be conscious of it, to think like we're just a part of this big, long chain. And that we're here, but that chain is going to continue for generations and generations and generations. And that, hopefully us being immersed in this longer timeline into the past gives us some inspiration to think into the future, rather than just like our own lifetime. It's kind of abstract, but maybe it makes, I don't know, maybe it might be a stretch, but I think maybe it fits at least somewhat. I think liturgical worship, there's an order to it. Not only in the tradition that I grew up in, the Protestant tradition, not only could it be sometimes kind of emotionally manipulative. Well, actually, I should say, one of the ways that it tried to kind of like keep your attention is that it would often have this element of surprise. Like we have to kind of like bring things out of nowhere, because we kind of keep you on the edge of your seat. So there was kind of like a denigration, a looking down upon churches where everything was so ordered that you kind of knew what was coming next. And in the Episcopal Church, we just kind of lean into like, you pretty much know what's coming next, right? There's a little bit of element of surprise in the sermon. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like life is so full of like surprise, sort of chaos, so out of our control, so profoundly different from one day to the next, let alone 1 year to the next. The curve of change is so steep. I don't feel like I really need to have that sense of like, I don't quite know what's going to happen next. To be able to enter in for an hour 10, something that has this kind of profound sense of order, it gives you a little glimpse into sort of a patterned, ordered, holy life that certainly has to flex. I mean, sometimes you've got a kid that is like completely melting down. I mean, we do have these elements in our worship that I think mirror kind of the holy chaos of life, the kids, and something spills at the altar, someone forgets a prayer, their mic is, I mean, like, things happen. But to be able to kind of enter into the peace of that particular order for a little while, as a little break, and then hopefully then we get a sense that there are things in our life that maybe we can't order in the same way that we order a liturgy. You can't script your day the exact same way as a liturgy, but you can build things into your day, times of prayer, connections with other people, these sort of habits and patterns that are good for the soul and good for humanity, that you can build those in with some regularity and some order. I like to think that that's what that helps with. What else? A few more. We've covered some of this. The transcendence and the immanence of God. Worship decenters the particular pastor. Worship is participatory. Worship, the whole purpose of worship, and I think this can get lost. So I do think, again, we're talking about kind of the shadow sides, we're talking about the downsides of everything has its downside. And so one of the things that we have to guard against in a liturgical tradition that is really places a high emphasis on beauty, on order, on this sense of beauty and order, is we don't want to worship the worship, right? We don't want worship to become an idol. That we don't want worship to be that you would come to worship just to experience worship. Because worship is supposed to transform us so that we behave differently out in the world. It's not supposed to be just this, even as beautiful and calming and centering as entering into that hour is, that isn't enough. And you see it over and over again in Holy Scripture, where especially God through the prophets in the Old Testament is like, you guys love your ceremonies. You love to break out the music, and you love to sacrifice 100 bulls at once, and you love to sort of show your love and devotion to me through the pageantry of your ceremonies in the temple. But God says, what I really require is that you look after the hungry, you take care of the orphan and the widow, that you are just to those who have less money. That's what I really require. And so worship is supposed to give us fuel to go out and do God's work in the world. That is the ultimate purpose. And I think I wanted to make this point too about sort of that ordered. A lot of what we experience in worship is kind of like the ideal life. So like people pass the peace. Well, when you pass the peace, it's kind of like this symbolic representation of the way that we should be passing the peace in our life. And when you pass the peace, that person may be voting, just like Matt's sermon, like that person may be voting different from you. That person may have a history that's very different from you, but you extend the peace of Christ to them. And so that's supposed to kind of overflow into our life. We share bread. The central part of our service is like we're sharing bread. Everybody gets fed. And that's supposed to be this symbol of the way God wants everyone to be fed in the world. And there's no hierarchy. It's not like, Paul in the very early church, he writes the letter to the Corinthians, and he's like, you guys are totally messing this up. You're letting the rich go first. Sometimes there's not enough at the end of the Eucharist for the poor. You're totally playing like the hierarchy, the status game in worship in the way that it happens in the world. But Paul's like, worship is supposed to be, the church is supposed to be this very different society where everyone is treated as God's child, and those status markers are erased. I love the point that the longtime chaplain at the Duke University, Sam Wells, he's now at the church in Trafalgar Square in London. He makes the point that the word companion, we're supposed to become God's companion in the Eucharist. And companion, the literal word of companion is pan is bread, I think in Latin and in French. So we break bread with God and with one another. And so we become companions to God, and we become companions with one another. And that's supposed to then translate out into us making those kind of connections and sharing the abundance that we have out in the world. So I always want to try to, sometimes when worship is so beautiful and so powerful, we can forget that, and I don't know that we can forget, but I always just want to make sure that we're staying open to the transformative power of what we're doing, so that we live it out in the world. I think I've probably kind of said what I wanted to say. anything else that you all have questions about or points that you want to make? We're at 10 till. Well, thank you for coming. I love that we ended up having, I don't know, there's like a holy dozen people in here. So awesome. Yeah, all right. Well, have a fantastic rest of your day. It's gorgeous outside, and who knows how long this will last. So enjoy.